For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sashni Madli. Joining me today is Pallo Jordan, here to discuss his book, Letters to My Comrades. Letters to My Comrades is a remarkable collection of your writings over a 40-year period as a freedom fighter and an intellectual. How did this collection of your writings come to be published?
It came to be published, I suppose, because two gentlemen thought that they should be. That is Butobi Mutlautse and Willie Khositsile. And as you'll see from the inside cover, they are the two people who compiled the articles. And then someone else by the name of Colin Bundy vetted them. In fact, what was published, I think, represents maybe half of what I had submitted to Mutlautse and Khositsile.
You spent many years in exile, initially following your parents to the US, but your studies in New York were disrupted when you were expelled from the US in 1967. Why were you expelled at the time, and where did you go?
Not so much expelled as a subtle way of doing it, which is to refuse to renew your visa, which compels you then to depart. No, I suppose the government of the United States felt that I was a terrible subversive, since I was involved in horrible things like opposing the U.S. aggression in Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and various aspects of the policies. It was interesting some years afterwards when I was applying for a visa to go to the United States from the embassy here, because the president had also, Bill Clinton had also been an opponent of the war in Vietnam. So I suppose U.S. administrations and government got to a point where they recognized that maybe I was right. The incumbent president at that point agreed with me. So that was interesting too, but that was many, many years later.
And in the 70s, you were involved with work for the ANC in Lusaka, London, and Maputo, mainly working for the Department of Information and Publicity. What sort of work did you do at the time, and what was your role in Radio Freedom?
Well, I was posted in London, and then Luanda in Angola, then Lusaka, sometime in Maputo, but most in Lusaka. The work that we were doing was very varied, I would say, the information department. When I was in London, I was working more with the publication, Sichaba, and with the research arm of the information department. When I went to Luanda, that was to help re-establish Radio Freedom. We'd run into some problems with some of our supporting states because there was a difference of opinion between the ANC and them about what was happening in Angola specifically. So we restarted Radio Freedom in, that was 77, yeah. And a small group of young comrades who'd just undergone training. And we began, I suppose, Radio Freedom Mark II in 77. And I was in charge of that, re-establishing it. What we did was to change it from what it had been before to what it became afterwards. Radio Freedom had been established around 1972, 73. Radio facilities offered by Zambia and Tanzania. In Tanzania, we had to share the airtime with the PAC because Tanzania recognized both movements. So we broadcast for 30 minutes, 3 times a week out of Dar es Salaam. In Zambia, the Zambian government had only recognized the ANC, So when we started out, we were broadcasting 50 minutes, I think at that point, probably 3 times a week out of Lusaka. At that time, I suppose one could say that the movement at home was in somewhat of a trough, and radio freedom probably was geared towards that, because it was more like an informational entertainment radio station. And you had interviews, you had cultural programs, etc., etc., etc. When we took it over in 77, the situation inside the country had changed very radically. You'd had the Soweto uprising the year before. There were thousands of people who had left the country. And the mood inside South Africa was very different. And Radio Freedom had to respond to that. So we changed it from being a sort of informational service to be much more an agitational one. So the format of the programs changed quite radically, I think. Strong emphasis on news, strong emphasis on news analysis, a strong emphasis on news commentary as well. By the time we were legalized, 1990, Radio Freedom was broadcasting from Luanda, from Lusaka, from Antananarivo in Madagascar, and from Ethiopia, and from Dar es Salaam. An hour from Antananarivo every day, an hour from Ethiopia, as I said, 30 minutes, 3 times a week from Dar. Lusaka, then we were broadcasting 50 minutes in the morning and 50 minutes in the evening, and then 30 minutes out of Luanda. So something in the order of 6 hours every day, you could listen to the ANC. And we had arranged things in such a fashion that there was very little overlap, in terms of time frames between the broadcasts. So if you were a very enthusiastic radio buff, you could listen to, you could start with Antananarivo and end up with Luanda all in one day if you wanted to. Most people didn't do that. But the idea was to beam enough information into South Africa from these various angles so that our footprint would cover the entire country. One had difficulty in gauging the effectiveness because obviously we couldn't do listener surveys. But I suppose the sort of listener survey that we did have access to was judging from what new recruits and people that one encountered in meetings outside the country who were living in South Africa had to say about Radio Freedom. The one definite signal of our getting through was the struggle songs that were sung in the camps, MK camps, ANC, exile communities. You heard being sung on demonstrations inside South Africa. Oh, that one got through. And then you'd get comments from people saying what they did and how they responded to Radio Freedom. There were groups inside the country who were unaware of them until about 1990 when we came back home, who used to tape the programs and then go and play the tapes, at other, I suppose, social or other gatherings, places where people were gathered. There were guys who used to take their radios to football matches and then turn it on when the Radio Freedom broadcast was on, you see. And, everyone who was around it, of course, would hear them. The signature for Radio Freedom was very ear-catching. Of course, deliberately so. It was a burst of light machine gun fire, right? Followed by slogans, and then struggle songs. So you turn on the radio and you hear that, you're bound to listen, right? So guys used to do that. So I think we were very effective in that respect. The other work that the information department did was the ANC publications. In the early period of exile, the ANC published Spotlight on South Africa, which was sort of a news digest, based on what was in the South African media. And then the other was a newsletter called Maibuye. By 1990, we had something like 6 regular publications. In 1967, there was a magazine that was published out of London called Sechaba. Then in addition to Maibuye, which was published out of Lusaka, there was Voice of Women, which was from the Women's League. And then we had a news briefing, which was taking that idea for News Digest even further. And then we had Dawn, which was the publication of Umkhonto Wesizwe. We also had Rishaka, which was the publication of the Department of Arts and Culture. So we had something like 7 publications by the time the ANC was legalized in 1990. And these came out quite regularly. Had different profiles, obviously, as well, because they were, if you like, in a way specialized. Like, although Dawn carried a lot of political and other analytical work, it was very much oriented to the people in MK. Rishaka, which again oriented much more to people who were involved in culture. And then, of course, the specialized women's section, etc. So we had those sorts of publications, and that's all the work of the Department of Information and Publicity. Then we had the research component, which of course was internally oriented, doing research for the movement itself. But we also published, I think, something like 6 or 7 papers, and smaller little publications that we did as well on topical issues. I would say all in all, the information department was a very important arm of the entire effort that the ANC was involved in, affecting both our external support, but very much oriented towards the internal support base of the ANC constituency.
And in '82, you were sitting across from Ruth First when a letter bomb exploded and killed her. From your perspective, can you tell us what happened on that day?
On that day, well, actually, we were preparing for a farewell party in Ruth's office. We had been at a UNESCO-sponsored conference on the study of social sciences in Southern Africa. And this was now the conference was over. But there was a Canadian scholar who had been participating in the conference and who had been working in Maputo, and he was going back to Canada, a man by the name of John Saul. And we were going to have a drink, sort of. So we were all, there were 4 of us in the office. Ruth, the head of the Center of Southern African Studies at the time, Aquino de Braganza, an American scholar, myself. So Aquino de Braganza walked in and he says to Ruth, sometimes I think that you're the big macher in this place. And she says, why? And he says, you seem to get more mail than I do. And she says, well, if you want people to write to you, you must write to them. If you write to people, they'll write back to you. And so everyone sort of giggles. So Ruth then goes down to the mailbox and retrieves her mail. brings it up to the office and, puts it on her desk and was then going through it. Akina was sitting across from me. She was over here. There was a desk between myself and Akina. Akina asked me something and I leaned across the desk to hear what he was saying when suddenly it happened. And I was quite amazed because you know how they depict things like that in the movies. It actually is exactly like that. Well, I mean, that's how you experience it, let me put it that way. Which is you always see the flash first, right? Because light travels faster than sound, even in a small space like that. So this huge pink flash and then this terrific explosion, right? And perceptually, it seems as if everything goes into slow motion. I mean, that's your brain, of course. Right? It's not that everything's going slow motion. And that was that. My eardrum was blown out, this one. This one was pierced because it was away from the explosion. And, Ruth was killed. Aquino was wearing spectacles. They broke, of course, and his ears, I think, also very badly damaged. Our other colleague standing by the door, she just got, I think, splinters, mostly. Ruth, I think, fortunately, was probably killed instantly. Afterwards, I surmised what her injuries must have been, because while we were at the hospital, I felt this funny sensation here. I reached out and found a fragment of bone from her wrist. And then all along my side here were fragments of bone and other tissue, small little scars. This eye, either the explosion or something hit it, but the retina got detached. So I had quite a number of injuries. Taken to hospital and was in hospital for something like 4 weeks. Maputo couldn't handle what needed to happen. Maybe they just didn't have the medical experts in Mozambique at the time. But I was living in Britain at the time and had been living in Britain for the previous 10 years. So I was in the National Health Service. So I could go to Britain and have my injuries attended to, which is what happened. I wasn't able to attend Ruth's funeral, of course, because I was in hospital. But that said a great deal about how desperate the regime was. I know afterwards the people who did it, Craig Williamson and them, claim that Joe Slovo was the target. But that is an outright lie. I say that with absolute confidence because Ruth would not have opened Joe's mail. And in any case, anyone who was targeting Joe would not have sent his mail to the Eduardo at Mundlane University. They would have sent it either to his own address or to the ANC or somewhere else, but not to the university. They were targeting Ruth.
Now, also in '83 in Lusaka, you were detained by the ANC's security department. Why did they detain you, and how did you get out of this predicament?
No. You see, what was the issue at the time was heavy-duty infiltration of the ANC by the regime. And I think in situations like that, and you'd had things like assassination of Ruth, and you'd had other assassinations, and in the MK camps, you'd had attempts at mass poisoning, etc., etc. So I think there was sort of a mood of spy fever, near paranoia in the security organs of the ANC. And they were, of course, acting like people do when they panic in situations like that. So there were terrible things that were happening and they were doing, etc. And some of us were very critical of what they was doing. Of course, in that environment of paranoia, why is he saying that we're not nice people? Why is he saying nasty things about us? Maybe he's one of them. Easily happens. So that was the context in which that happened. But of course, because I was not involved with the enemy and any enemy activity, in the end, I had to be released. But it was a function of, I think, environment of paranoia induced by the shock of realizing the extent to which the enemy had infiltrated ANC ranks. And also perhaps seeing how effective some of those infiltrations were. Because apart from attempting to injure people physically, the intent of the enemy obviously was to get political intelligence. And they had planted their agents very carefully, specialized for various tasks. And as happens in situations like that, they were distributed amongst a number of the regime security organs. Some were working for NIS, some were working for military intelligence, some were working for the special branch. And as happens in situations like that, you'd think that intelligence agents would naturally cooperate, but they don't always do that. They sometimes work at cross purposes. So there were agents who had been planted, let's say, for instance, by military intelligence, whose sole job was to sabotage the ANC's transport. So every time someone was given, let's say, a truck or a car, it would come back very badly damaged. There were others whose assignment was to sabotage the war material that you had. By messing with it in various ways, so that if, for instance, you used a particular weapon, it might even blow up in your hands, injure you. There were others whose mission was to be sleepers, get yourself into a position where you can rise and have some influence. Don't do anything for a long time. Rise in the ranks till you reach a position where you can then have access to critical intelligence and then start working, etc., etc. So, there were these various levels of infiltration and penetration that were happening. And of course, once they were uncovered, the security people did get, I think, a little bit hurt. And, wouldn't say it's inevitable, but I think in environments where people are very paranoid, they get up to excesses. And that was the environment at the time.